Cool. Hopefully it's not actually backwards, because it looks backwards on the screen. Hello, if anyone's watching online. Cool, so I'm going to kind of walk through what is queer theology. When I say queer theology, I'm curious if anyone like in your brain has a sort of working definition of what you think that means. Yes, no, maybe.
I'm going to not raise my hand.
Yeah. Maybe. Anyone?
I feel like I don't see what you just said, but kind of the crossroads of where the queer identity fits in theology, and maybe creating a framework of how to approach theology from the queer perspective so that you don't feel isolated from religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. There's no right answer. I was just curious, you know. I am not. Cool. That's fine. Feel free to jump in at any time, but I'm going to give you sort of my operational definition. And again, there's not one definition. But because this series we're kind of starting off, and we may next semester, if folks are interested, keep doing more. There's lots of individual topics within the realm of queer theology that we could dive into. I wanted to give you a little bit of orientation of who I am. I think that's my slide. Just so you kind of know where I'm coming from. I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm a first-year master's student online at Chicago Theological Seminary studying religious studies with kind of a focus on queer theology. So this is very much like a pet project of mine. I grew up sort of in a more conservative evangelical church for most of my life, and I have been kind of swimming in who knows what sort of religious waters for the past few years, as I've been at the Crossing, which has been a great place to sort of support me in that. I am queer. I do use that word for myself. I'm also non-binary and agender and pansexual and a bunch of other more specific identity words. So that's kind of my perspective. I have an undergrad degree in pastoral theology from a more conservative perspective, but since then have done a lot of work in queer theory. So I kind of have a bunch of different pieces in my brain, that's kind of the perspective I'm approaching it from. A couple of like housekeeping things of kind of as representing the Crossing and the sort of queer students of faith perspective, is our mission like acknowledges full affirmation. Like we acknowledge that like the debate of whether or not queer people are welcome in religion is kind of a moot point for us as an organization where like, yes, they are. Queer people are fully loved, and also we acknowledge that a lot of harm has been done to LGBTQ plus people in the name of religion. So we just want to like name that that's kind of the world that we're swimming in. Queer people can and do desire to have spiritual lives and religious community. That's something that most of you, if you're in this room, probably have some inkling of that. But there are a lot of people in the world who don't maybe grasp that or don't realize how many queer people either have spiritual lives or want to. And so you can't easily divide queer issues and queer community and religious issues because there are so many people that sort of live in both of those spaces. And today, we kind of want to move beyond the conversation of can you be gay and Christian, to reiterate that. But I do want to say as a caveat, like that is a place in a conversation that a lot of people are at. So that's a conversation we can have. And if you have questions about that or want resources about that question specifically, please talk to me or Becca, I'm sure, or Mallory, who also works here. Because that's absolutely a viable conversation, but we're also trying to move past that and not stay in that conversation. And then just to note that a lot of what I'm talking about comes from the work of mostly American and sort of UK scholars around queer issues, but knowing that there is no one queer story, the perspective of like a transgender person at the intersection of faith and spirituality and identity is going to be different than that of like a cisgender gay man, and that if you're not from the US, like you might have a different perspective of what churches sort of where you're from sort of engage in this issue. And it's going to look different based on your social location. So I also wanted to have that caveat that if anyone's like, this is the intersection of being queer and being religious, that's going to look different based on who you're asking and where you're doing that work. And then finally, I just wanted to share this meme that Becca and our friend Amir and I kind of used last time we did a workshop like this. That kind of shows the progression of the conversation we're trying to have. It's the brain meme, and maybe it's old now, probably, this format, but it's like small brain is homosexuality is a sin. Bigger brain is the love the sin and hate the sin. Enlightened brain is that queer people are welcome in religious spaces. explodey brain, I guess, is we fully, well, yeah, we affirm queer identities, and then full ascendance, which is what we're trying to get to, is that LGBTQ plus Christians are a gift that the church needs. So that's kind of the trajectory of what we're trying to move to, is not just do we welcome queer people, but what do queer people have to offer religion? So that's kind of the trajectory. So a little bit about that question of what is queer theology. There's a work that was published in 2000, so this is like 21 years old that this work has kind of been being done, longer than that, but by Marcella Altheus-Reed, has a book called Indecent Theology, and her definition of what queer means. Queer is not oddity. We speak of queering or indecenting, which is a term that she has coined, as a process of coming back to the authentic, everyday life experiences described as odd by the ideology and mythology makers alike. Indecenting brings back the sense of reality. So there's a lot we could get into talking about the political definition of queer, but her kind of point here is that queer is a examining the power structures, and she talks a lot about reality. And so she talks about heteronormativity, this idea that everyone is straight, that everyone is cisgender, is not only harmful, but it's just not true. And so she talks about it as a twisting of reality. And so she talks about queering as coming back to the truth that we know from people's lived experiences. And she would describe, there's much more to say about that, but that's sort of an introduction of what we mean by queer. Another scholar, Lynn Marie Tomstead, describes it this way. At least one influential scholar in queer studies writes, queerness can never define an identity, it can only ever disturb one. And I really like this. This is not, at least as far as I read it, exactly to negate the various ways in which people identify and the utility of such identification, but rather to point out that identification is never complete, never unambiguous, never uncomplicated. So as someone who identifies as queer, I do use that word for myself. I also know that it has a complicated history. I know that it has been and still is, in some cases, used as a slur, and so I know that there's a long story history there. But I really like this idea of queerness as disturbing things and never kind of being settled. So I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. I just wanted to establish that if we're going to talk about queer theology, it's helpful to think about what we mean by queer and what we mean by theology. So what we mean by theology, I think that's nice. Simply put, if theology is defined as talk about God, comes from two Greek words, theos and logos, which is God, and word. Some scholars use the phrase God talk, which I really like. Then queer theology can be understood as queer talk about God. And I would add my own note that it's not just queer talk about God, but how humans interact with God specifically. Some people would define theology simply as philosophical ideas about who God is, but I think theology always has to be in context of how humans are understanding that, because you can never really get a picture of God without a human lens. Yeah, that's all. And then there is no Christian theology, only Christian theologies. And I think this is helpful as queer people. Can be kind of a freeing concept, is that there's not one way to look at God. There's not one way to understand religion. There's always plural. There's always multiple perspectives. Even though there might be one train of thought, if you're from a Catholic background, or if you're from a Lutheran background, your tradition might have one stream of thought that they can trace from Jesus to today of what's been considered correct teaching, and then everything else has sort of been rejected as heretical or wrong. But all of those people that are considered heretical and wrong were also doing theology. So at any point, you have lots of perspectives, and people on the margins have always been doing theology and always been talking about God. So it's also important to notice that those theologies that have been passed down as the one orthodox position are usually the ones written by white European men. So thinking about theologies plural helps us understand that just because these other perspectives weren't always written down, or they weren't always codified into like the official creed of the church, doesn't mean that they weren't there. people always are doing theology from their social location. I think something you might hear as an objection to the idea of queer theology. It's like, well, why do we need a queer theology? Why can't we just have theology? Why do we need something specific for LGBT people? Why can't we just have neutral theology about God? Well, I don't think there's ever such thing as neutrality. I don't believe in that concept because even if you're a white European male from the Enlightenment in the 1700s, that's still a social location, right? Like that's still a lens, that's still a perspective that you're bringing to theology. It's just the most that academia has determined is the most unbiased, which is not true.
And then we can almost just as easily, instead of saying like theology and queer theology, we could say like theology and straight theology.
Yeah.
You know? For
real.
It's like, why do you need a straight theology?
Yeah.
Like, why does your theology need to take into account the fact that you're straight? You know, it's,
Yeah.
Right, like de-invisibilizing the white male cisgender heterosexual identity that's always taken as assumed as the default. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like everyone, like voices on the margins always get adjectives, right? We always get adjectives in front of what we're doing. It's like, let's study, Asian American history, or let's study African diaspora history, but then they're like, the history of Europe is just history. Like, until you get into like specialized interests, but like the way they teach it in high school and stuff, like it's seen as like, this is the default. And there's no such thing as a default. And that's, once you can like sort of unlearn that, I think it's much easier to appreciate the beauty that's happening in these more specific sort of worlds. And then also queer theology didn't pop up out of nowhere. Like there are traditions of liberation theology, which kind of came from South and Central America as a resistance against power and colonization, feminist theology, and womanist theology, which specifically addresses the needs of Black women in Africa and the diaspora. So like there have always been people doing this work, and queer theology is just one of those ways. So I want to pause there. So that's kind of like how we're defining queer and how we're defining theology. But does anyone have any like thoughts or questions around that? Yeah.
Do you think that disturbance have a negative tone?
Disturbance. Yeah, that's a good question.
Because I think like queer or trans, I see it as something that could initiate change, or like what are the boundary of the categories. But if someone says that queer disturbances some like normative thoughts, I would think that could come from people who are normative because they think they disturb us.
Like it can be a criticism of queer theology just as much as,
But yeah, like because you're disrupting, and disrupting can certainly seem like, it depends on the perspective. Yeah.
That kind of reminds me of how, people always expect the marginalized group to do the work themselves. Like they are offering help. There's like, I don't know how to word way to say this, but like they expect us to take on the burden, and that's frustrating. And that I can kind of see what you're saying. We expect Black women to do the forensic anti-racism work when it should be, white people educating themselves, and that we always push it on people who are already marginalized, and you're fighting an uphill battle even more so because you have to educate people on your identity, and you also have to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like when I came out to my parents or whatever, they were like, "What does that mean?" Like, because I'm asexual and into women, so they were like, "Well, how does that work?" So I would like teach them about it, and like it's like I shouldn't have to do that in theory. I can't imagine if I was like not cis, like within this, like I don't know what that means. So yeah. Can't imagine. That must be very difficult.
Yeah.
It must be very difficult for anyone. But I just think it's very interesting how society places a burden on people who are already burdened by society.
Yeah. But I almost wonder if that like ties into what Bianca's saying about like there's that phrase that talks about disturb the comfort or
Yeah.
disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed, right?
Right,
But-
art, that's where the quote often comes from, is like, good art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. I was also gonna bring up that quote.
Yeah, but I guess like if I'm thinking about that in the context of what you said, like the onus is on the marginalized person to do the disturbing and to do the comforting, and it's always like, at what point are you like, you're a tool to sort of fix society almost? Is that kind of like, and like, should that be your job? Just a question.
Yeah. We're getting to like even bigger galaxy brain. I think.
Yeah.
Because, right, because that's a very valid discussion point. I think it's important to say queer people are a gift to the church that the church needs to learn from. But I think it is very dangerous then to assume, therefore, it is the responsibility of queer people solely to fix the church.
Mm-hmm.
It is more that just like queer people need to exist, and I think our very existence is disruptive, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
like our very existence is challenging to people who look at us and make assumptions about who we are, or who look at us with our partners and make assumptions about who we are. That then like they should do that looking, and then they should initiate that work to then like address the problems and the systems that they're a part of, right? So yeah, it's like a very tricky edge there.
Yeah, and my mom always says, why do you need all these identity terms? Why can't you just love who you love and stuff? It's like, it's very having the identity term every day, and it's like, well, it's because we live in a system that like tells us we need to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's just very complicated.
Yeah.
This is like I'm yeah, this is a weird talk. But yeah, it's a complicated topic.
I think it's interesting that with the points brought up, the idea of like having to be both the disruptor and the comforter, like you were saying, Benjamin, because I think in my mind, that is a way for people of the majority to exhaust the people on the fringe and then use that as a, like, oddly enough, like a tactic of manipulation so that no real change actually occurs. Because there's like a dual expectation to have us do all the work, but also make sure we're doing it comfortably for them. Which is why I feel like nobody actually wants radical action. They just want to like comfortably be the person to be like, yeah, that's a good idea, but then they don't actually want any change because they still want power. Because what we're trying to do is get power, and they don't want to give it to us because they think it's the scarcity mindset of having one pie and there's a limited amount of resources, but especially in the church, I feel like that's not a scarce asset at all.
Right.
So it's kind of intriguing.
Yeah.
Really interesting. And I keep thinking of, we expect queer people to be the first to do everything, same thing with like people of color and all these different identities. You're supposed to be like, oh, I'm supposed to be like the one forging the path for future, people, I don't know, in your group or whatever, but at the same time, you get tired doing that kind of stuff. Like, that kind of calls into question like performative activism and stuff, like how much are you actually supporting people who are trying to make a better path for people behind you? Like, I'm in a sorority and stuff, and like, I was sometimes, like, it's like everyone's super welcoming and stuff with me bringing a girl to formal and stuff, but like, it's kind of exhausting to have to like explain to people, oh, this is my girl, like, whatever, not that I'm a girlfriend. But you know what I mean? It's kind of exhausting to have to say, like, oh yeah, this is my girlfriend, anywhere you go, and having to justify it to yourself as well as other people. Like you're justifying to yourself why you haven't justified to other people.
Yeah.
This is getting into like a therapy.
No, I appreciate all of those perspectives because that's very, very real. And like, I think what you're saying about power is really important too, because like queer theology draws a lot from sort of queer theory. people say secular queer theory, but I don't want to call it that. And a lot of what queer theory is doing academically, like analyzing power, and what a lot of sort of work on the margins is about power. And I really think that that quote on that last slide about God talk or talk about God, and queer theology being queer talk about God, to me that implies, like when I hear queer, I'm thinking of power structures, and I'm thinking of dominant narratives, and so I'm thinking queer talk about God is, how do we think about who has the power to talk about God? Who has the power to determine how we understand God? Who has the power to determine who has access to God? Because I guess it depends on your theological framework, but for me, like, God is something that we can only access through human language and ways of understanding. Like, to me, God is, people have so many different ideas about who God is, right? And so, like, there's no really way to get at that without using some sort of human formulation, which people have been doing for thousands of years. And to queer that, so to speak, is to figure out, like, who has the power there? Like, who has the power to decide how we're going to talk about this? How we're going to, if we're going to have organized religion, how is it going to be organized? You know, yeah. Cool. Yeah, feel free to interact with me at any point. I love this. So, kind of looked at queer, we kind of looked at theology. I really love this quote. This is, again, I wish I had a physical copy of it. There's this little book that's like 150 pages or less. I have resource pages if anyone wants to take them. Before you go, it's just sort of bibliography of some of the things that I'm quoting, and also a bunch of other things that I would recommend. But there's this little book called Queer Theology Beyond Apologetics, which a lot of the rest of this comes from that. And it's a short little book, but it's that's just so good. It's so good. But this is how she summarizes what queer theology should be and what it should be for. It needs to take the messy realities and complexities of people's lives seriously. It needs to stand against the distortive powers of capitalism and colonialism. It needs to express and honor human bodily being. It needs to get beyond the search for identity, fixity, and finality, and it needs to be about God's presence in, identification with, and love for the body, the way God calls us to bring love, lust, and justice together. And so she talks a lot about queer theology also being a theology of the body that's grounded in experience, and also this line about beyond the search for identity, fixity, and finality. There's some really beautiful stuff. If you've ever kind of gotten into that weeds of like identity language, like you were saying, Beth, or like the complexities with the word queer, she handles it in a really, really beautiful way, in my opinion, of valuing that language that we have to sort of talk about ourselves, but also valuing it as something that doesn't need to be fixed or final, but that it's sort of process of being human. So I really love that. Where am I at?
I have to get to work.
Oh.
I have a shift that starts at 6 p.m. So can I just?
Yeah.
I'll see you on Wednesday.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I'm working.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. It's good to see you.
I wish I could stay. No, you guys are bye. To then see you again.
So we've already kind of gotten into some good discussion, so I don't know how, maybe I won't spend a ton of time on this, but a lot of times when you try to get to, like with that brain game, you try to get to this place, depending on what context you're in, especially if you're from a church context, it's kind of hard to get there without addressing some of the other ones, right? And so some of the common objections or questions that you're going to hear right away are, for example, doesn't the Bible condemn homosexuality? Or, for example, can't you welcome LGBTQ plus people and still hold to a traditional sexual ethic, such, so to speak? Can you be welcoming but not affirming? My asterisk is that traditional means heteronormative purity culture. And I'm sure we could fill in the blanks with a lot of other things, right? And kind of what I want to say with queer theology is that queer theology doesn't ignore these questions, but that the end goal is to move beyond that. Because queer theology is not, in my definition, theology about queer people or theology for queer people, but theology by queer people and theology from queer people. So this is not everyone sitting around in a room deciding what to do about the gays, because the gays have their own thoughts and relationships and experiences with God, and those things deserve to be at the table. This trajectory that I'm going to take for a second comes from that book I was mentioning. But I kind of want to juxtaposition kind of two different approaches to queer theology. There's what I like to call queer apologetics, and then there's like queer theology. So apologetics is like a term that basically means defending what it is you believe. Early Christianity had people that they called apologists, who basically were defending their practices that seemed strange and weird to other religions or to the Roman Empire. And so apologetics was sort of like, let me write out a step-by-step defense of why I believe what I believe, to either legitimize it or to convert people to it. And that's the way I say that. I hope that doesn't sound like it's always negative, because I think there's a time and a place for that. And I think queer apologetics is a specific field of study that's exploded, especially in the past 20 years, as more and more religious denominations have become more accepting of queer folks. But we know that there's a lot that aren't, right? And so queer apologetics is this field that's kind of explaining and defending against those criticisms on the last slide, against those criticisms of like, how can you get to the full like beauty of what queer people have to offer if you're sort of operating at this level of like, well, doesn't scripture say this? Thankfully, there's a lot of people that are doing that work. Some of these you might know. God and the Gay Christian came out about 7 years ago now, and that was a really big one where it was sort of a chapter by chapter analysis of sort of like the 6 passages in scripture that seem to condemn any sort of like same gender relationship. Bible Gender Sexuality is doing the same thing. This book, Wrestling with God and Men, came out in 2004, and it's by a gay rabbi who's sort of doing that work specifically in the Jewish tradition. So there's a bunch of these. On this bibliography thing I made, there's a list specifically of books that are doing this. And I just want to say that they're very helpful. Like, there's a lot of spaces, especially like if you're coming from a background where that's the dominant question of like, can you be gay and Christian? There's a lot of really good work out there to address it. And for the rest of this series, we're not really going to spend a lot of time with it. And I just kind of want to acknowledge that it's a strategy that's there. And if you have questions about it, these are great resources. I can give you more. What they're addressing, this is the clobber passages. There's anywhere from like 4 to 8, depending on how you count them. I count 4 main things in the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures that seem to condemn any sort of queerness. One is the Sodom and Gomorrah story, which you probably all are somewhat familiar with. The purity codes, which is the Leviticus, the you shall not lie with a man type verses. There's a verse like that in Leviticus 18 and 20. Pauline theology, there's a sermon from Paul in the first chapter of the book of Romans, where Paul sort of says some anti-queer things in a longer sermon that's about other things, but that's for another day. And then early church morality, there's 2 other New Testament letters, 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1, that include a word that's translated homosexuality in a list of vices. So these are kind of the bulk of where that sort of queer apologetics work is happening, is with these like 12 sentences. And that's super valid, because for folks that hold to a really high view of scripture and scripture that's been passed down in the Jewish and Christian traditions, it's really important for people to know what scripture says and what it means. And so there's a time and a place for that. And that's not the end of the story. So
I will just throw in
Yeah.
a word that is translated probably very dubiously.
Yes.
Homosexuality. Like, Matthew Hines does a great job on that. Like,
yes,
we actually have no historical record of what arsenokoitai means.
it's a word that's
people
kind of
just
thrown together.
decided that because it's a portmanteau of roughly man-med, that it means homosexual. And then he makes the point that, like, the word understand has nothing to do with standing under anything, and it's like, this entire part of Christian homophobia is based on like a faulty assumption about translation. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of great work in those books because, like, especially for me, like, I read that book when it came out and I was still wrestling with some of those sort of biblical questions, and there's a lot of really good work in those books. I'm going to go through this super quickly. This is a summary just of one of the chapters from that queer theology book, where she does something that I'd never read before, where she kind of takes all those books I mentioned and more, kind of summarizing the queer apologetics. She's kind of the one that, like, I'm borrowing this from, this idea that there's that specific kind of queer theology. And she summarizes all of their arguments into 12 types of arguments. I really highly recommend reading it, but I'm not going to spend much time on them. I just want to read them to you. So she says there's 12 ways you can basically address those questions. Is God male? Question mark. Eyebrow raise question mark, so to speak. Arguments from historical difference. Arguments from representation and reinterpretation. Jesus was good, Paul was bad. Gays aren't sinners. That's also the one I would call what Matthew Vines calls good fruit argument. God's love radically transgresses every boundary. I think in the life of the church, this is the best one, in my opinion. The argument from food and circumcision is a very specific, weird story about Peter in a dream. Ask me to tell you about it sometime. The argument beyond nature. The argument from eschatological transformation. Eschatological basically means end times, Jesus coming back, apocalypse. And then the argument from apocalypse, they're similar. The argument from Jesus' words, and then the argument against judgment. So most of those books are using some combination of these rhetorical strategies to say, oh, this one badly translated word in 1 Corinthians says gay people are bad. It's like, let me use one of 12 ways to tell you why you're wrong. And some of these might not be convincing to you, and that's totally okay. Some of them, they're all sort of based on different logical strategies, but there are lots of ways people have already sort of had this conversation. That's why I wanted to put this up here, that people have been having that conversation. There's lots of ways to have that conversation, and we can definitely spend time on that. But does anyone have any other comments here? I don't want to talk at you forever.
Maybe the computer fans in their brain are spinning.
Oh yeah, I feel that.
Lori, did you have something?
Yeah, kind of another like comment about Pauline theology. I just finished reading a book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and did you read that?
Is that Rachel Held Owens?
It's like Elizabeth Barr.
Oh, okay. I have not read it, but I've heard it.
So she talks about how like patriarchy in the church is a thing, and Pauline theology is used to cement that. But actually, there's very strong arguments to say that like the style that Paul preaches in is actually very counterintuitive to what we call it today, where it's like maybe like a little bit sarcastic, where he like is he's saying things but doesn't actually mean what it says, and then he'll like refute it in the next lines, or he'll take the beliefs of that day and time in his passages, and then like you think he's saying he agrees with those beliefs, but he's actually not, and he's using it as a way to point back to the society of the time, which was like, it was really cool to read that as a perspective from like learning about how patriarchy has been used as a tool to suppress women.
Yeah.
So you brought that up in the slide. And
yeah, that's super interesting. Well, and that's, a lot of these, and the one I am super fascinated by, like, language and sort of etymology, and so, like, there's a lot of these that super fascinate me are ones that are kind of, like, talking about how, when we're reading our Bibles today, how we got our Bible is a really long, complicated story that involves a lot of translation, and so it's really hard to say, well, this sentence says this in my English Bible that was published in 2011, and so therefore Paul said this. Well, it really gets a lot more complicated than that when you think about how words are translated, when you think about, for example, like puns. Like in our writing, when we make puns, if you translate that over the next 2,000 years, someone 2,000 years from now is probably going to miss the pun that you made. If it's in a different language, like those types of things don't always translate over time in language and culture and all those different things. So there's a lot of, I'll have to read that, but there's a lot of issues with just translation in general. that make it hard to make sort of anytime someone says the Bible clearly says ... my mind starts to like, which Bible and what do you mean by clearly? There's a lot of questions there, and I'm someone that there's parts of the Bible that I really love, and there's parts that I wrestle with, but I don't think it clearly says very much. Cool. I think I just have one or two more slides, and then just some sort of prompt discussion, further thought things. But so there's a lot of work that's happening beyond that conversation. All that to say, that conversation around, well, doesn't the Bible say this? There's a lot of good work happening there, but that's not the end of the conversation. For a lot of people, I think that tends to be the end of the conversation. These are just a couple books this is the one I've been quoting. I just threw up some that I know about that are kind of doing that work. Queer Virtue is a book that Becca and I have talked about a lot. That is a wonderful book. Just this subtitle: what LGBTQ people know about life and love and how it can revitalize Christianity. So that's kind of where that brain meme came from, of queer people have something to offer and revitalize the church. Moving from apologetics to queer theology, how can and how are LGBTQ plus people shaping theology and shaping the future of the religion? So that's kind of the question that we're moving towards, and that's what this field is kind of moving towards. Is it's just a different premise, and both have their time and place. But as someone who is very queer and very interested in religion, this excites me a lot more because, like we were talking about earlier about the exhaustion, I think there's a time and a place for me to sit down and explain to someone why this one word in Romans doesn't mean what you think it means and blah, blah, blah. But that conversation's like, it takes so much out of me, and I'm kind of tired of having it. And I understand that for some people, that one conversation might change their mind, and that's beautiful, and I celebrate that. At the same time, some of these subtitles, how embracing queerness will transform your faith, like that brings life into me, and that excites me in a way that some of the other work doesn't. And that's just kind of where I am personally, and everyone, is in their own place. But
yeah, it's not just, am I allowed to survive, but how can I thrive?
Exactly.
How can I give back to the world? How can I offer myself to the world?
Yeah. Cool. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm going to stop the stream here, and we can just kind of chat. But is there any questions at that, or just observations that brings up for anybody?